Bilal ibn Rabah, the slave whose voice echoes in every Adhan. 5 times a day, in every corner of the earth, a voice calls people to prayer. It rises over the rooftops of Istanbul, over the deserts of Arabia, over quiet apartment buildings in cities that never saw a single grain of Meccan sand. Millions of people pause what they are doing. They turn toward a direction, toward a house built by a prophet thousands of years ago. And most of them never ask a simple question. Who was the first man to raise that call? Who was the first voice, the very first sound that turned a whispered command into a public declaration of faith? His name was Bilal ibn Rabah, and before he became the sound of Islam itself, he was something the world tried very hard to erase. A slave, owned, beaten, treated as property with no name worth remembering. This is not just a story about the Adhan. It is a story about what happens when a human being refuses to let his body define his worth. When faith becomes the one thing no master, no chain, and no burning sun can take away. This story is not just history, it is a mirror for the heart. Because underneath the historical details, underneath the 7th century Arabia and the names you may not yet recognize, there is a question every one of us eventually faces. What do you do when the world tells you that you are worth nothing? What do you hold on to when everything visible says you have already lost? Bilal's story is recorded across the earliest biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, compiled by scholars like Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham within a century or two of his life. It appears in the Hadith collections that Muslims have preserved with extraordinary care for 14 centuries, passed down through chains of named narrators, each one checked, questioned, and weighed by generations of scholars before a single account was accepted as reliable. This is not folklore passed down by accident. It is a story the earliest Muslim community considered so important, so central to understanding what Islam actually asks of a human heart, that they built an entire discipline of verification just to protect stories like his from distortion. And by the end of this video, you will understand something remarkable. The very moment Bilal's voice was chosen to call the world to prayer was not an accident either. It was the result of a decision so quietly radical that even now, most people miss what it actually meant. Keep that question in mind as we begin. Why him? Out of every companion of the Prophet, why was it the freed slave from Abyssinia, whose voice would echo through history longer than any king's decree, any empire's law, any human ranking system ever devised? Let's go back to the beginning. Mecca, in the early days before Islam spread, was a city built on hierarchy. It sat along the ancient trade routes that connected Yemen to Syria, and its wealth came from caravans, from the pilgrimage traffic around the Kaaba, and from alliances carefully guarded by a handful of powerful clans. Tribes mattered, bloodlines mattered, wealth mattered. Honor was inherited, not earned, and a man's worth was often decided before he ever spoke a single word, simply by which family had raised him. And at the very bottom of that hierarchy stood the enslaved. Bilal was born to an enslaved mother named Hamamah, and by most accounts, his family had roots in Abyssinia, in the region we now call Ethiopia. He grew up owned by a man named Umayyah ibn Khalaf, one of the most powerful and most hostile opponents of the new faith the Prophet Muhammad was preaching. Picture it plainly. Bilal had no legal rights. He could be sold. He could be traded. His labor, his time, even his silence belonged to another man. In the eyes of Meccan society, he was not quite a full person. He was property with a heartbeat. And then, quietly, something changed inside him. When the message of Islam began spreading through Mecca, it carried an idea that terrified the ruling class. It said that a black slave and a wealthy tribal chief stood as equals before God. Not equal in wealth, not equal in status, equal in worth, equal in the sight of their creator. For men like Umayyah, this idea was not just religious talk. It was dangerous, If a slave believed his soul carried the same value as his master's soul, the entire social order was at risk. Bilal believed it anyway. He accepted Islam early, among the first handful of people in Mecca to do so, at a time when there was no protection, no army, no political shelter for the new believers. And when Umayyah discovered that his slave had accepted this new faith, he did not simply scold him. He decided to break him. Bilal was not alone in facing this kind of punishment. Other early converts, who had no tribal protection, no wealthy family to shield them, suffered in similar ways during those same years. A family remembered as Yasir, Sumayya, and their son Ammar were dragged into the desert heat under Abu Jahl, one of Mecca's fiercest opponents of the new faith. Sumayya, Bilal's contemporary in suffering, is remembered by early Muslim historians as the very first person to die for the sake of this message, killed for refusing to renounce what she believed. Her husband Yasir did not survive the ordeal either. Their son Ammar endured torture of his own and lived, carrying the memory of his parents for the rest of his life. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed by their family during those days of suffering, he is reported to have told them simply, "Patience, family of Yasir, your promised place is paradise." These were not isolated cruelties. They were part of a deliberate strategy, an attempt to make an example of anyone without status who dared to believe differently than their masters. This is where Bilal's own trial unfolds, and it should be difficult to hear, because what happened next was not a myth designed to shock you. It was recorded, remembered, and passed down precisely because the early Muslim community wanted every future generation to understand the price some people paid for saying simply, "I believe." Umayyah dragged Bilal out into the open desert during the punishing heat of the Meccan afternoon. He stripped him and laid him on the burning sand, and then he placed an enormous boulder on Bilal's chest, so heavy that Bilal could barely draw breath. The sun beat down. The rock pressed harder with every passing hour. Umayyah stood over him and offered a way out. Renounce this new faith. Say the names of the old gods. Just say the words and the pain stops. Bilal, gasping under the weight of stone and sun, repeated one word. Ahad. One. Not the many gods Mecca worshipped. One God, Ahad. Umayyah pressed the boulder harder. The heat blistered Bilal's skin against the sand, and still, through cracked lips, barely able to breathe, Bilal whispered it again. Ahad, Ahad. Think about what that moment actually contained. A man with no legal power, no army, no wealth, no name that mattered to anyone in that society, had exactly one thing left that could not be taken from him. His conviction. And he held on to it while his own body was being used as the weapon against him. This is the fear point of our story, and it is a real one, because most of us will never lie under a boulder in the desert sun, but many of us know what it feels like when the world applies pressure, when circumstances press down on our chest and whisper, "Just give up what you believe, it would be so much easier." Bilal's answer to that pressure has echoed for 14 centuries. One word, repeated, refusing to break. Now, take a breath, because the story does not end in the desert. Word of what was happening to Bilal reached a man named Abu Bakr, one of the earliest and most devoted companions of the Prophet, and a man of considerable wealth and standing in Mecca. Abu Bakr walked out to where Bilal lay under the sun and the stone, and he made Umayyah an offer. He would buy Bilal at whatever price Umayyah demanded. Some accounts describe Umayyah initially raising the price out of spite, wanting to punish Abu Bakr for interfering. Abu Bakr paid it anyway. He did not negotiate for the cheapest deal. He purchased Bilal's freedom, and then, without hesitation, he freed him. Not to keep him as his own servant, not to gain a follower who owed him a debt. He freed him completely, for the sake of God alone. This was not the only time Abu Bakr did this. Early biographers record that he went on to purchase and free several other enslaved believers in Mecca who were suffering for their new faith, among them Amir ibn Fuhaira, and a small number of enslaved women with no protector and no voice in that society. His own father is said to have once questioned why he kept spending his wealth on the weakest and least powerful people in the city, rather than on those who could repay him with influence. Abu Bakr's answer, in essence, was that he was not investing in people who could help him. He was investing in people who needed help. That distinction mattered then, and it still says something important about what faith is supposed to look like in practice, not only in words. Let that moment settle. A man crushed under a boulder for saying, "One," was lifted from the sand by another believer who understood something essential. Faith was not meant to be a private comfort while the world burned around it. Faith demanded action. Abu Bakr's wealth, spent to free a suffering stranger, became one of the most quietly powerful acts recorded in early Islamic history. Bilal rose from that sand a free man, but freedom, as many people discover, does not erase the past instantly. He carried the scars, physically and otherwise, of what he had endured, and he now faced a new question. What does a formerly enslaved man do with a freedom he never expected to hold? He did something remarkable. He stayed close to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he became one of the most trusted companions in the growing Muslim community. Status in the old Meccan sense, tribe, bloodline, wealth, meant nothing in this new circle. What mattered was sincerity, service, and closeness to God. And in that new measuring system, Bilal was not at the bottom anymore. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. How much of what we consider our worth is actually assigned to us by systems we did not choose? Tribal status in Mecca was not something Bilal earned or failed to earn. It was imposed on him at birth. And yet the moment he stepped into a community built on a different foundation, faith rather than bloodline, his worth was recognized instantly. That is not ancient history. That is a pattern still worth noticing today. When persecution in Mecca grew too dangerous, the early Muslims made the hijra, the migration to Medina. Bilal went with them, and it was in Medina, in this new and fragile community trying to organize itself, that the next major turning point of his story unfolded. The Muslims needed a way to call people to prayer. There was no Adhan yet, no established call echoing across the city 5 times a day. The community discussed options. Some suggested lighting a fire on a hilltop, visible from a distance, but this felt too close to the fire rituals of neighboring faiths. Others suggested a horn, similar to practices among Jewish communities nearby, but this too felt borrowed rather than distinct. Others suggested a wooden clapper or a bell, similar to church traditions used by Christian communities in the region. None of these felt quite right to the growing Muslim community, which wanted something distinctly its own, something that came from a human voice rather than an object or a flame. According to the narrations preserved in the Hadith collections, a companion named Abdullah ibn Zayd had a dream. In it, a man taught him the words of a call to prayer, phrase by phrase. Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Hayya ala salah. He woke and went straight to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to describe what he had seen. The Prophet listened and recognized the dream as true guidance. Around the same time, it is reported that Umar ibn al-Khattab had seen something remarkably similar in his own sleep and came forward independently to confirm it. The words were settled, but someone needed to actually call them out, loud enough for the whole city to hear, clear enough that no one could mistake the meaning. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, chose Bilal. Think about who was standing in that community. Companions of noble Meccan lineage, wealthy merchants who had sacrificed fortunes for the faith, warriors already known for their courage, and out of all of them, the honor of being the very first voice of Islam's public call to prayer went to a formerly enslaved man from Abyssinia, chosen by most accounts for the depth and beauty of his voice. This was not a small gesture. In a world still shaped by old hierarchies, even inside a community trying to leave those hierarchies behind, the Prophet's choice sent an unmistakable message. The highest honor in this new faith was not reserved for nobility. It was given to whoever carried it best, regardless of where they came from. Bilal climbed to a high point near the mosque in Medina and called the words for the very first time, Allahu Akbar, God is greater. The words rose over the young city, over houses and gardens and streets still adjusting to this new way of life. People stepped out of their homes. They turned toward the mosque. A slave's voice, once used only to whisper, Ahad, under a crushing stone, now called an entire community to stand before their Creator. That is the moment worth pausing on. The very thing used to try to silence him became the thing history could never silence again. But Bilal's story was not finished. There was one more meeting waiting for him, one that would close a very old and very painful circle. Years after his enslavement, after his freedom, after becoming the trusted voice of the young Muslim community, Bilal marched with the Muslims to the Battle of Badr. This was the first major military confrontation between the small Muslim community and the powerful forces of Mecca, fought at a time when the believers were vastly outnumbered, lightly armed, and had little more than their conviction to rely on. It became a defining moment in early Islamic history, remembered ever since as proof that faith and unity could outweigh numbers and weaponry. Among the Meccan forces that day was Umayyah ibn Khalaf, the very same man who had once pinned Bilal beneath a boulder in the desert sun. According to the accounts preserved by early historians, Bilal recognized him on the battlefield, and in that moment something long buried surfaced. The pain of the sand, the weight of the stone, the years of being treated as less than human by this exact man, all of it converged into a single instant. Sources report that Bilal called out, identifying Umayyah to other Muslims nearby, and in the fighting that followed, Umayyah was killed. This is not told as a story of personal vengeance triumphing gloriously. Islamic tradition is careful about how it frames such moments, understanding them within the larger context of the battle itself, not as a settling of private scores. But it is impossible to read this account without feeling the weight of what it represented. The man who once believed he could crush a slave's faith with a boulder now faced the consequences of a war his own hostility helped provoke. And the slave he tried to break stood free, armed, and part of a community that would soon reshape the entire region. If you have ever endured genuine cruelty from someone who held power over you, you understand the particular ache of imagining a moment like this. Not a call for hatred, but a quiet recognition that oppression does not last forever, and that dignity, patiently held onto, eventually outlives the systems built to crush it. The story does not stop at Badr. It moves forward 8 more years to one of the most emotionally significant days in early Islamic history, the conquest of Mecca. After years of exile, persecution, and war, the Muslims returned to the city that had once cast them out. They returned not for revenge, but largely through negotiation and remarkable restraint, entering the city that had tortured its early believers with an overall spirit of forgiveness rather than retribution. Many of the very people who had once persecuted the Muslims were spared, forgiven publicly, and allowed to remain in the city they had once ruled through fear. And in this moment, tradition remembers something extraordinary. Bilal climbed to the top of the Kaaba itself, the sacred house at the very center of Meccan life, the same city where he had once been property, and he called the Adhan from its heights. Consider who was standing below, listening. Former enemies. Men who had once mocked the Muslims, who had tolerated or even encouraged the persecution of the earliest believers. Some of the very tribal aristocracy that once viewed a man like Bilal as barely worth counting as human. And now his voice, unmistakably his voice, rang out over the city from its most sacred point, calling all of Mecca to prayer. It is remembered that some of the old Meccan nobility, standing below, muttered bitterly about a black former slave standing atop their most honored site. And it is remembered that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, responded to such remarks by affirming, firmly, that honor in this faith belongs to piety and sincerity, not to lineage or skin color. Some later commentators have connected this episode to the spirit of a verse revealed around that period, reminding people that they were created from different nations and tribes only so that they might come to know one another, and that true honor before God rests on righteousness alone. Whatever exact words passed that day, the meaning of the moment itself needs no embellishment. The system that once discarded Bilal as worthless now stood beneath him, listening to the voice it had tried to silence forever. There is one more chapter to this story, quieter than the others, but perhaps the most emotionally powerful of all. Bilal remained close to the Prophet Muhammad for the rest of the Prophet's life, continuing to call the Adhan in Medina. But when the Prophet passed away, something shifted in Bilal that those around him could see clearly. His grief was profound, and according to accounts passed down among early biographers, he found himself unable to continue calling the Adhan in Medina because the sound of his own voice calling the words brought back the presence of the Prophet so vividly that it became almost unbearable. Every phrase reminded him of a city, a mosque, and a companionship that no longer had the same shape without the man who had once chosen him, above every wealthy and well-connected companion, to be the very first voice of the faith. He asked to be excused from his role, and eventually left Medina for the region of Sham in modern-day Syria, where he spent his remaining years, reportedly dedicating himself to service on the frontier and to the wider work of the young Muslim community spreading through the region. Then, according to a widely repeated account among the biographers, something happened during a visit tied to the Caliph Umar. When Umar came to the region, some accounts say the people of Medina, or the companions gathered there, asked Bilal to call the Adhan one more time, wanting, perhaps, one final echo of the days when the Prophet still walked among them. Bilal agreed. He climbed up and he began the call. Allahu Akbar. And as the words continued, the companions gathered there, hardened men who had survived battles, migrations, and years of hardship, began to weep. It is said the entire gathering was overcome, remembering the Prophet, remembering Medina in its earliest days, remembering everything that voice had once meant to them. Grown men who had buried friends on battlefields, who had marched through hunger and exile without breaking, found themselves undone by a single familiar call rising once more into the sky. We should hold this account with appropriate care, as some details vary between different narrators and collections, and not every version carries the same strength of authenticity. But the core of it, a formerly enslaved man's voice moving an entire community to tears decades later, fits everything else we know about the depth of what Bilal represented to the people who lived alongside him. So now we return to the question we opened with. Why him? Out of everyone in that early community, why was the voice chosen to call humanity to prayer, forever the voice of a man once considered worthless property? Because the entire structure of the message Bilal devoted his life to rested on a single radical claim. A human being's worth is not determined by birth, by wealth, by the color of their skin, or by what other people decide to call them. It is determined by the sincerity of their heart and their willingness to stand firm when everything around them says to give up. Bilal proved that claim with his own body, lying under a boulder in the desert sun, repeating one word until his oppressor gave up before he did. Every single day, in cities across every continent, that same call still rises. Allahu Akbar. The words Bilal first spoke in Medina, the words he repeated atop the Kaaba in Mecca, the words that reportedly brought an entire gathering to tears years later in Sham. 14 centuries have passed. Empires that once seemed permanent have crumbled into dust and footnotes. Umayyah's name is remembered now mostly because of what he did to a man he thought he could break. And still, 5 times a day, somewhere on this earth, a voice rises in the same pattern Bilal established, whether the caller realizes it or not. There is something worth carrying with you from this story, beyond the historical details. If you have ever felt small, overlooked, defined by circumstances you never chose, Bilal's story offers a quiet answer. The world's ranking system is not the final one. What you hold on to in your hardest moment, what you refuse to let go of, even when the pressure feels unbearable, that is what actually determines your place, not in this world's eyes, but in the eyes of the one who sees everything. Bilal held on to one word under the weight of a stone, and that single word outlasted every empire that tried to silence it. It outlasted Umayyah, it outlasted the old hierarchies of Mecca, and it still rises tonight, somewhere, in a voice carrying on what a slave once began. If this story moved you, there is another moment in early Islamic history waiting, one just as quiet, just as easy to overlook, and just as powerful once you understand what was really happening beneath the surface. Stay with us, because the next story picks up exactly where faith was tested again, and mercy answered in a way almost no one expected.